Hello and welcome to Synthesized Sunsets. Today we're joined by Quantum, a software developer and author of several iconic works of sci-fi web fiction from the past couple of decades. His recent bestseller, There Is No Antimemetics Division, came out in print last year and combines several of his online tales about anti-memes, entities that attack memory, identity, and the fabric of reality itself. Quantum is also the author of three other self-published novels, a contributor to the crowdsourced horror wiki SCP Foundation, and the creator of the adversarial Wordle clone, Absurdle. But most importantly, he has been a favorite author of the host of this podcast for many years, and so we are very excited to have him on the show. So to start things off, Quantum, could you give our listeners a brief explanation of what an anti-meme is?
So anti-meme, it has two different definitions. There's at least two that I'm aware of, and there's one of those definitions which I just got to ignore because if you go on Reddit, there's an r anti-meme subreddit, which is quite fun, but it's not really the meaning of the word that I'm looking at. So in the way I'm describing it is a meme is a contagious idea. It's an idea that there's some element in that idea that says share this with other people, disseminate this idea because, and there's a lot of reasons why you might want to spread an idea. So a joke is a good idea because if you share it, people laugh and they think you're nice, they think you're cool, they like you. There's ideas, a lot of, but ideas can be as small as a joke, but they can be gigantic. Like any real world religion is a large idea. Any philosophy, any economic structure, like capitalism is an idea, communism is an idea, democracy is an idea. These are gigantic ideas, and these are ideas which you spread around because you think this is a good way to organize yourself, or organize your community, or run a world, or something like that, or because it's to your advantage to spread it. And some ideas are contagious, but some ideas kind of aren't that contagious. Some ideas like do gangbusters. They're If you look at social media, what you're looking at is kind of this window into this ideatic ecosystem of things that are competing for attention. But some things succeed in that ecosystem and some things kind of don't, which is not necessarily a good or bad thing. And just because an idea succeeds or fails doesn't mean it's a good or bad idea. Those are completely separate things. But I started wondering, okay, what's at the other end of that spectrum? What kind of ideas don't get shared? And there's quite a large class of ideas in that bucket. There's things like there are taboos and secrets and things that you don't want anyone to find out about. A good example of a secret would be like my passwords. I am strongly disincentivized to share my passwords with anybody. That's a piece of information that I will keep to myself. But also sometimes there are laws against expressing certain ideas. Sometimes there's like an injunction, or in the UK we have a thing called a D notice, which is like, do not talk about this. It's a news event, but you're not allowed to talk about it because there are potential legal repercussions. There's a lot of different reasons why you might not want to share an idea, and anti-meme is just kind of an umbrella term for all of those things. Ideas can be anti-memetic for a lot of different reasons. They can also be difficult to explain, or really complicated and difficult to transmit to other people, or just like random or dumb. Um, but then for the purposes of fiction, this kind of becomes kind of interesting because like, what if you have an idea which is dangerous while also being anti-memetic? What if you have something where, for whatever reason, even though it's right there, as plain as can be, it's like a physical object just sitting there or standing there, you can't see it, or you can see it, but as soon as you turn away, you don't remember it. Like maybe if a person is anti-memetic, maybe they can trip you over, and you don't know that you tripped over. After you get up, you forgot that you tripped at all. There's a lot of really interesting stories that just fall out of that idea kind of naturally, and that is what There Is No Antimemetics Division is. It's a story about people who have noticed that these things exist, and the procedures that these people have to follow in order to tackle dangerous anti-memes.
Yeah, and it's been really cool to see. I think this idea has sort of broken containment, I guess you could say. Like I've heard people talk about the anti-meme idea, not even in the context of like discussing the book, but just like, oh yeah, like anti-memes from There Is No Antimemetics Division. So I mean yeah, ironically, the idea of the anti-meme is very mimetic, I guess you could say. So there's definitely a lot more to discuss on subject anti-memes, but before we get too deep into the content of There Is No Antimemetics Division, I want to talk a little bit about it as like an artifact. So Antimemetics is not a normal book, right? It's maybe not quite a novel in the conventional sense. Like there are redactions, gaps, and the structure overall is kind of disorienting in a way that's not typical of a normal sci-fi book. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a timeline of how Antimemetics actually came into being, and then how it went from its original state into its current form.
Sure. So basically, like a lot of books of late, this kind of started life as like a web serial. Um, I don't know how much context like you and your listeners have for the SCP project, but the SCP project is like it's an online fiction community. It's a writing community basically, which where people write fiction in the fiction about the mysterious SCP Foundation, which is like a paranormal research agency. Basically, it's the kind of scientific agency that similar to the Men in Black, kind of like the X-Files, kind of like the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense in Hellboy, that kind of approximate background. But because it's a collaborative effort, and you can take that very basic framework and write almost anything you want around that, it becomes this kind of fiction community. And so basically, yes, this story started life there. SCP started around 2008, and I wrote what is now the prologue of this book for the SCP project in 2008. And then some time passed, and I wrote some other things, and I left the project for quite a few years. And then I came back, and I went, "Yeah, this prologue, like this is an interesting prologue. There is more meat on this bone. There is more to explore." And so this book was written serially. Basically, it was written kind of one chapter at a time in front of for the benefit and for the enjoyment of my fellow SCP readers and writers. And because the way SCP is structured, the way the project I mean is structured, it encourages standalone stories. It encourages like isolated, relatively brief works of self-contained fiction, which I think is it's one of the strengths of the project. It means that the text that's on the project is very accessible. Like you can just dip in and out. You can just select something at random. You can see what's new and just read it, and you can get a complete experience out of that. Which I think is great, but it also encourages contributors. It means that you can write one story and see whether it does well, then you can write another story if you want. Which is why this book, when you read it, at times kind of feels like an anthology. There's a lot of standalone stories that you like. Chapter one of the book, I think, is just a standalone story. You could just read that by itself, and you'd have a complete experience. I think quite a lot of the book is like that, which is partially, but that's because of the origins as a serial of work. But also, I think it is thematically appropriate because the book is about characters who are acting without context. They are coming to new and frightening situations, and they aren't able to remember that maybe they've been in a situation before, once or 100 times. And but maybe we, as the reader, do remember. And so there's a certain amount of dramatic irony in there. There's a place where you're wondering, like, I know the answer to this problem. Can the character figure it out? Or are they doomed? Or I don't know what's going on. The character doesn't know what's going on either. How are they going to attack this question? Are they making intelligent moves? Oh, they are. That's cool. Let's see if they succeed. So I think it's just it's semi coincidental, but I think it's really thematically appropriate that it's a serial work. That's why it's structured like that. So to continue the story, yeah, I wrote that on the SCP project, starting around 2015, finishing up around 2020, I think, and it was very popular on the SCP project. And various readers went, "Hey, if you were to make an ebook of this, I'd read it." I went, "Sure." I made an ebook, self-published it, and then people said, "Hey, if you were to print a copy, like print on demand, I'd read it." So I printed it out, and eventually it became popular enough that I was able to find a traditional publisher, and that's the version that I think most people have read at this point. So yeah,
So, changing a bit, but continuing with sort of the structure of the book, previous guest Alexander Wales recommended this commentary voiceover you did of the incredibly complex indie time travel film Primer, which we both love. And I think in a lot of ways, Antimemetics functions very similar to a time travel or time loop story. And I was wondering if this is something you thought about at all when writing the book, or yeah, you see a connection there due to characters forgetting their memories a lot, being just like thrown into these strange situations without proper context and that sort of thing.
That's a really interesting point. That's a deep cut. I recorded that ages and ages ago, and every now and then I listen back to it, and I'm like, I have many more things to say about this movie now. I wish I had formed my thoughts better before recording that podcast. But I think I'm not sure about memory wiping because there isn't too much of that in Primer, and in most time travel stories there isn't as such. But
Well,
what does
well, well, I
happen?
guess what we're referring to is the fact that like the characters that aren't looping, right? They're sort of
Yes,
being like reset in their state in a way.
yeah, they are, the world is changing around them without their knowledge. The world is
Mhm.
being like moved around while they're not looking and bent to somebody else's will. That is absolutely something that happens in Prime, which I think is very interesting, where like there's a scene in Prime where the characters are actively discussing, it's kind of implied, but they're saying to themselves and each other, like, what if other people invented this time machine before we did? Like, how long has this technology been out there? Like, who are the most powerful people in the world? Do they have this box? Is that what's making them so powerful? But the same is broadly the same is true as antimemetics, where there are powerful forces at work, and it's not clear what form they have or how they operate, but you can see their fingerprints, and based on that, you can start to build a framework for what might be really happening, which I think is an interesting thing that you can really do and do hard in sci-fi. That's something where you can get a lot of mileage out of that kind of thing. But it's something you don't see too often in a sci-fi film. You don't see a sci-fi film from the perspective of a bystander. It happens now and then, but the moment I remember is there's a bit in Back to the Future too, where old Biff is just witnessing a DeLorean with Doc and Marty in it, like just disappearing in a flash of flame. He's like, "What the hell is going on here?" And he works out what is going on and he turns it to his advantage, which is like that's interesting. That's an interesting direction to go in. So yeah, there is that commonality there. I think it's about interesting rules and then unpicking those rules and bending them to your advantage.
Yeah, I think one challenge from that is both of the two main characters from the novel, Marie and Adam, at least in the print version, I think are pretty strongly characterized, despite the fact that they have these sort of Swiss cheese brains and are constantly leaking their memories and getting put into some position without any of the memories of anything that's happened before. And did you have any challenges when writing of like creating a character that isn't able to rely on like a consistent sense of identity from like a memory of their events?
It was difficult. I mean, from time to time, it's difficult where you're like, okay, what does this character know? What don't they know? In this particular story, I think that's actually easier than it can be in some stories because, to a first approximation, they don't know anything. Um, and they might have dim memories. Like, it's very easy to go, well, this character forgot the events of that chapter, and so I don't need to think about it that hard. But no, no, I'm being flippant. Like, there was a lot more thought that went into it than that. What I do think, though, is that there are different kinds of memory and there are different kinds of things that are in one's mind. In the real world, people have mental illness. They have dementia. They can start losing their critical faculties. But I feel that in some of those cases, at least one's personality remains largely intact. Like if someone is polite and cheerful and loving, they do stay that way. They don't forget to be polite and cheerful and loving. So that core, I think, the fact that there's a core to you that is persistent, I think is interesting and worth hanging on to. And it's certainly something that both of the characters you're talking about do display, despite all the nonsense that they're going through.
Yeah, I think one thing that makes antimemetics work really well, in my opinion, is that, I mean, obviously, the events of the story are not true and not
Hmm.
possible, but there's some level to it. The more you think about it, the more it feels possible. Like, if you imagine the amount that you perceive, and then when you're selecting for what you're able to perceive versus what you could perceive, potentially in any given moment, it's like such a small amount, and then it's such a small amount that is actually successfully able to get converted into short-term memory, and then from there it's like such a small amount of that converted into a long-term memory. And if you can just imagine some entity just nudging the process a little bit to make you assume something is normal that otherwise your brain would register as anomalous, it's sort of easy to imagine how you can get to some pretty, like, missing some pretty extreme things, as happens in the story.
Yeah, I think that's a genuine thing that we experience. I mean, hundreds of years ago, like you would walk around and look at things, and then at some point, someone discovered infrared light, and when that happens, you're like, wait. how long has infrared light been there? Which objects emit infrared? Where does it come from? And then there's we're sitting here in these rooms, but there's entire electromagnetic spectrums that are passing through these rooms at different intensities and different directions and different colors that we are not aware of right now. There are things that are too small for us to see, and things that are too big for us to see, and things that are happening too fast and like millions of times too slowly to properly observe. And antimemetics just adds another layer to this. It's like, well, some of these things are perfectly visible, but they're antimemetically cloaked. You can't remember them anymore. And so we're just viewing the whole world through these incredibly narrow filters. But this is science, right? Like, we discover that we have limitations and we go, okay, let's work out how to break out of this. Let's work out how to start picking up data from the rest of these channels. This is something that comes up in the book. She says, like, there's like 45 of us who have the medication necessary to see antimemetic things, and there is the entire cosmos to look at through this new lens. We're kind of short-handed. It's a real problem. Yeah, it's true. There is a lot of the world that is difficult to remember. Like, we can't remember all of it, so we have to pick and choose. It's a very interesting place to be.
Just to sort of give a sense of this idea, I just wanted to read a quick passage from the book here. So this is they're like on site at the Antimemetics division headquarters, and it's two people talking to each other. There's a stone in the forest behind the site, Morgan blurts. It's monumental. It's like a skyscraper. It blots out the sun. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. But I've never seen it before. I don't understand how it's possible that I never saw it. It casts a shadow across the whole site. I mean, was it always there? Yes. Is this because you took your first routine dose of upgrade Nustex this morning? Yes. Morgan seems alarmed. That's how it works? Something that big can just be right there and we don't see it? Yeah. So,
Yeah.
this type of thing happens a lot in the book where there's just some kind of massive, gigantic thing that is just able to camouflage due to these antimetic properties surrounding it.
Yeah, absolutely.
To change lanes a little bit, one other thing I really appreciated about the book is that it had a lot of momentum throughout, I thought. I think a lot of sci-fi books that are more abstract and heady can get sort of like bogged down in conceptual space where you're in idea land for too long and nothing's happening and it starts feeling like nothing matters too much and you get lost. And I think Antimemetics like often felt like a thriller, and kept moving forward, and something new and crazy is happening in every chapter. Was this something you were like really focused on, trying to make sure that there was momentum moving forward when writing?
Well, thank you for calling that out. Like, I like, speaking personally, when I'm reading, I like a story to move. I like stuff to happen. I feel every now and then I read a book that like was very well received and very popular. Like, this book was about 110 pages longer than it should have been, than it could have been, and I think trimming some of that fat would have been to the book's advantage. But that's just a personal preference. Like, other people are like very happy to read very long works. I'm okay with that as well. There's absolutely a place for that kind of thing. It's not a blanket statement, of course, but again, this is an artifact of serialization because as a writer, I would say I write relatively slowly compared to most writers. And so if I'm putting out one chapter a month or every few months or longer, then people are waiting and I want something to happen in that chapter. I want the story to move forward materially. I don't do filler. I don't want to waste anyone's time. I want something concrete to step forward, and the situation at the end of the chapter is different from what it was before. And so as a serial, that means that I'm wasting as little of the reader's time as possible, and I'm not keeping people waiting. But it means when it's all formed up into a single book, that book moves pretty quickly, which I like. I think I like the effect. I'm okay with it. Thank you.
So on Synthesized Sunsets, we often talk about what makes web fiction qualitatively different from other kinds of fiction. And particularly, we're talking about fiction that couldn't really exist without the context of the internet. Like, without the internet being a thing that is in the world, it just wouldn't make any sense. And I would say that some of your fiction definitely fits into this category. I was wondering, like, to what extent do you identify as part of web fiction as like a discrete genre of literature? Do you consider yourself an author of web fiction, or do you just consider yourself a sci-fi author, or maybe even just an author, and not really associate yourself with that term?
I am absolutely in web fiction. Yes, that's me. I would call it a medium rather than a genre. But yeah, so to be honest, like SCP, as a project, as a member of the SCP project, my writing is relatively pedestrian compared to what you can actually do on the web. there's certainly on the SCP project, there are like really large, expansive, complex operations, like loads of images and CSS and formatting and things being hidden and slowly revealed in special effects. There's a lot you can do with the web when it comes to fiction, and the people on the SCP project are doing some pretty ambitious stuff, which I greatly respect and I enjoy a lot of it. My stuff on the SCP is actually relatively restrained, and so I stick to plain text for the most part. There's one bit in the original serial which is still online. Once you get there's a particular chapter where you see the special containment procedures for a particular anomaly, and then it just says end of file and there's a keypad, and you need to enter the correct code into that keypad in order to read the rest of the entry. The idea being like this is a containment unit. There's a documentation outside of the containment unit. There's different documentation inside of the containment unit, and you have to enter the correct code. It's a nominal small bit of interactivity, and you need to be concentrating on the story to know what the code is. I'm not just going to tell you the code directly. You can figure it out if you know what you're doing. But that little bit of interactivity, that's fine. It's enjoyable. It adds a little bit to the flavor. But something I'm increasingly conscious of is that I love web fiction. I think it's great, but it doesn't translate well if you want to make like an ebook version, and it doesn't translate so when you go to a print edition or an ebook edition or a print edition or an audiobook edition, all of those format shifts, you always lose something but you always gain something. It's an opportunity to create, it's an opportunity to go, okay, what some of my existing tools have been lost. I can't put JavaScript in an ebook. I can't, not very easily. No, I don't think I can, not at all. What can I do in an ebook that can't be done elsewhere? We can't use like gigantic black monoliths in an audiobook because we can't just blast the reader with static for minutes on end. That doesn't work. What can we do? And so, yeah, it's different media, but I think plain text has a lot of value as well. So yes.
Yeah, I would agree with the statement that maybe your fiction isn't the most webby in terms of the multimedia aspect, like what you can do. I mean, there's definitely some pretty crazy things that can be done in this way, but I would say like I think one thing that is definitely unmistakably web fiction about your work, and this is probably more applicable to your collection Valuable Humans in Transit than it is to Antimemetics, but you can really tell that the author of this book was actually like a frequent user of the relative parts of the internet, or at least that's or at least a very convincing illusion. We wrote this article where we were comparing some of your stuff favorably to other kinds of science fiction, where I feel like now, like in mainstream science fiction, kind of trying to emulate online elements is very much in vogue, trying to present something as though it's like a message board or trying to present something as though it's a chat room.
Yeah.
And this is typically very well received. But I think a lot of the time when I read these, I'm like, this person has not used IRC, or this person has not really spent that much time on Discord. It's pretty clear that like this, like the way that they're using the medium is kind of purely to serve this narrative purpose, and it also doesn't really exist to be like an artifact of the internet in itself. And when I read some of your stories, in particular, like The Difference, there's sort of intentional typos, and in general, it kind of has this IRC-esque like cadence or rhythm that you might really see online. And so I was sort of wondering, like, if you had any memorable experiences or phases of your life online that really informed like the way that you write about these things.
I am a child of the internet. This cannot be denied. I first got online in like the early mid 2000s when I first got online. A major part of my earlier years was a web fiction project. Well, not a fiction project, but a web 2.0 community called Everything 2, which is still in existence. I drop
I think
back
I've
in
heard of
every
everything too.
year or two. Everything 2. Great community, like lots of weird stuff, lots of interesting little bits of writing, some of which makes no sense and actively makes no sense. I was like, yeah, great. And some of which is like charming or horrifying, or like, there's factual write-ups in there as well. There's reviews and like political events and people posting about their day. It's a relatively small scale by modern standards, but there's a chat room attached to that. And I spent probably like 10-15 years in that chat room. I made a whole bunch of friends, many of which I still have right now. Many of which are still my best friends of all time. So yeah, I know what a chat room is like. I know how to write a conversation like that. The key point. So I'll let you in on a secret. If you're trying to write realistic IRC style fiction like that, what you want to do is just not use the backspace key at all. You write a sentence, and like if you think, oh, I can do that better, you don't do that better. You press return and write a second sentence, or put an asterisk in there, or something, because that's how it works. That's how you really do it. We're here on Discord, right? Like, I think quite a lot of people listening to this will understand how chat on Discord works. But I think it's interesting that you call out, like, you can tell when someone's a phony. Like, this person is pretending to write internet style fiction. This person has not actually been to the internet. Come on. That's funny. On this topic, I'm going to call out Accession by Ian M. Banks as a great bit of sci-fi, but some written where you read it, you're like, hang on a minute. Ian M. Banks has clearly spent time on IRC, and that is, well, it just adds to the texture, it adds to the flavor because it's completely realistic that like these gigantically intelligent ships will be talking to one another and getting fractious and disagreeing and like switching channels to avoid talking to people they don't like. It's great. I love that stuff.
Another thing that I would say is sort of web fictiony about your work, and maybe even like software-y, is that I think you're one of the only authors I know whose work is very explicitly versioned. Like you will have one version that will be on the internet, and then you'll kind of write another version and be like, this is a newer version of the story, but you can go back and look at this other version. I think most authors will kind of just scrub the internet of like any older or draft versions of their old work because like, they don't really want to look at it anymore. But I think like for you, not only do you leave them up, but I think sometimes the like later version you don't necessarily present as strictly an improvement in every way. Like I remember you put this thing up on your website called The Worst That Could Happen, which is
Yeah.
sort of like, a redacted version of the beginning of one of your chapters that did make it into the final book. And you were sort of explaining how it didn't make it into the final book, but you still think it's worth having on the internet. And I think the idea of just having like different versions or modules of the stories that you have in the world is kind of a concept that's a little bit novel because it's not really something you can do in traditional print in any sort of like realistic way.
Thank you. It's not something that people do too much. It's something that you could, in theory, do. So let me draw an analogy. The chapter that you're talking about is kind of a behind the scenes kind of thing. It's a deleted scene. Basically, it's under a section called deleted scenes, where like I wrote a lot for Antimemetics that I took out in the end, but I felt isn't worth reading as part of Antimemetics because if it was, it would be in the book, but is worth looking at because I enjoy sharing the process and I enjoy talking about those creative decisions. So that's one of the reasons why I keep those online because I think people would read that chapter or another chapter and go, ah, yeah, I see why this was removed. And sometimes that's for a good reason, sometimes it's for a bad reason. It's like, ah, that chapter was terrible. I can see why that was removed. That's fine. But also because there's plenty of stuff that I have never put online and is not fit for publication in any way. There's plenty of stuff I deleted that I deleted that because it was nonsense. And also because there's no conceivable way that a reader could get a positive experience out of reading it. So that's fine. But also, firstly, like the web is gigantic. It's very easy to just leave stuff online. I don't like breaking links if I can avoid it. You've got Valuable Humans in Transit in front of you, and those are most of the stories in there are like rewrites of earlier versions of stories that I've left online. I feel this way for historical reasoning, for historical purposes. So, for example, take the Star Wars movies. They were released in one edition, and then they were re-released in special editions. And George Lucas tried to have would have preferred to have those earlier versions removed from history. And creatively speaking, I feel like he does have a right to have a preferred version of his movies. Like, I respect that a great deal. But like, these are significant things, and from a historical fiction perspective, we should have access to those earlier things, even if they're not like officially blessed by the creator anymore. And I feel like the difference between those versions is instructive and worthwhile. And also, like on a practical matter, that would break links. And there's ways to fix broken links. You can just redirect to the new one. But I don't like actively removing stuff from the web.
Taking a little bit more of like a wide angle view of your work. So the article that we actually wrote about your book, Antimemetics Division. It wasn't really I don't know if you read it, but it was not really a straightforward review. It was sort of more of like a weird narrative about fiction on the internet in general. And one of the claims that we make, which I'm curious to hear if you agree with, is that, or fiction is not really as optimistic about the internet as it was when Antimemetics came out in its online form. Like I think
Mm.
that kind of like in the mid 2010s, especially in like the first half, there was really a lot of optimism about the web as like this kind of ascended form of literature. Like, wow, we can do books, but like on the internet, and there's just all this crazy stuff you can do. And I think like kind of right around like 2014, 2015, 16, 17 even, there was just like mass proliferation of all kinds of crazy online doodads and ways of storytelling. But I think that in the wake of COVID and social media and all of these related things that have made people disillusioned with their time online, I think this has also kind of led to a tempering of expectations of what people want from the internet. Like I think that nowadays there's a lot of people who don't really want the internet in their book. They kind of just want a book. I think I sort of had like mixed feelings encountering Antimetics in that like I do love the story, but I think that you were like your average reader of Antimemetics in the bookstore, right?
Mm.
They are probably not going to then go and explore the ecosystem of web fiction, right? They might, but this is not necessarily like a natural direction to be pointed necessarily, and I kind of see that as just part of this like newer trend. Like I think there's actually been kind of like a regression in some ways, like attention being
Mm.
directed from the internet and web fiction to print fiction as a result of internet fatigue. So I was wondering if this is something you've also observed or like not really, and how this influences your perspective of your future as a writer.
You have touched on a lot of different things, and I'll see if I can remember all of the ones that I wanted to call out. So, firstly, uh, I think there's a technical aspect here that perhaps you haven't that may be part of this. So building a website takes certain skills. You need to be able to write HTML or JavaScript or some or both, ideally
Mhm.
both, and that requires certain skill. And in the old days, HTML was relatively simple and JavaScript was essentially non-existent. And creating a website, you would have to get hosting of some kind, but all you needed to do was write HTML and then upload it, and that was pretty accessible. And it was firstly it was an interesting and exciting new set of toys, especially in terms of communication with other people. But it hadn't really been explored, and that is like a new frontier. That kind of thing is fun. That's great. There's plenty, like nearly anything you could do has not been done before, and so you can just build a crazy like internet hypertext fiction, that kind of thing. Um,
You don't have to disable cores or enable
nope,
HTTPS or anything
no,
like
no, 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 you don't.
that.
But as time has gone on, firstly, the complexity of a modern web page has gone up and up and up. And in particular, making a web page work both on a desktop computer and on mobile, at all kinds of screen resolutions, all kinds of orientations. Like building a new piece of web fiction now is actually quite a bit harder than it previously was. And so I can see that people might be getting turned off by that kind of thing as a venue for creativity. Additionally, I would say that the web has been like calcifying into a collection of large platforms. There was a time when there were many more websites, and they were very inventive, and they were all differently structured. And as time has gone on, you don't if you're a small business, you don't need your own website. You just go on Facebook. You have a Facebook page instead. That's sufficient for quite a lot of small businesses, because if you're in the business of like plumbing or babysitting or something like that, you don't need a full-on website. Like a web page on Facebook is sufficient, and Facebook does not give you those creative tools. You are very limited in how you're able to express yourself. You've only got a few. You've got bold and italics and images and some emojis, and that's about it. And there's not a lot you can do with that in terms of expression. There's always something, like every different platform has something that you can do. Twitter, I find in particular, is or was like great for like this is the Google People, the story in Valuable
Yeah.
Humans. That actually ran on Twitter as a live thing. That was fun. And so there's always storytelling possibilities, but like they have been kind of closing up a little bit. Lastly, though, on the topic of books and things, like there's nothing wrong with a book. Books are great. Everyone loves books. A book is something that you can have and own. There's no DRM, right?
Yeah.
Amazon's not going to switch off your book. They can't do it. They can't. What they also can't do. This is the most recent thing I noticed is that I heard that they can't retroactively modify the text of your book while you're reading it to change a particular reference from something to something else, which I have mixed feelings about. I think like that technology, I think was probably originally created for the purposes of fixing typos, which I'm in favor of because the first versions of all of my books had typos in, and I'm glad to have that opportunity to fix them. But like, no, retconning a book to be more modern by changing the version in your hands, I'm not sure I'm a fan of that. Whereas a print edition has its merits. So I don't know. I like that we have both. You know, I think there could be more web fiction. I think web fiction could be a bigger thing now than it once was, and I feel like the loss of optimism. I don't think that's. I think that might be good to do with a bunch of other things as well. You know,
Oh
um,
yeah, certainly.
tech in general has become much less of a promise and much more of a threat now than it once was.
Oh yes, I mean I think that kind of an underrated factor as well is that as time has gone on, and especially I think COVID was a really big inflection point for this. A much greater share of people on the internet are people who just do not particularly care about the internet or want to be there. They just kind of have to be there. And so if you're
Mhm.
assessing like the opinion of the internet as a whole, it's actually a much different group of people than the group of people who was on it in even like 2010. And this is in
Absolutely.
general a group of people who do not care nearly as much about the internet as a project. So I think that's a factor as well.
Yeah, the promise of the web has kind of been and gone. You know, like it is now a known quantity, and a lot of people. But also, like when you grow up inside of something, it doesn't have much novelty. The web, for people of my generation, the web was a new thing. Like it didn't exist before, and now it did. It was an amazing new thing. People are growing up now who like are younger than Discord is, and Discord is just a feature of the war. Like they are not wowed by Discord. It is just normal for them, and so they don't understand perhaps that Discord has faults and it could be better. You know, that kind of thing. I don't know, but yeah, it's just this is what comes of getting old, you know. Amazing new technology, but people become disillusioned by it and start taking it in stride. I don't know.
So I guess more specifically, like, what do you see the future of web fiction looking like? Like, do you think web fiction still has a lot of life left in it, or do
I
you think
think
we've kind of seen it mature?
I think it always will. I think there's a lot that has not been done, and the question might be like, why hasn't it been done? And it might be just because it might be that the market for it is relatively narrow. It might be, as I say, like the technical aspects of making it happen are relatively limited. No, most notably, most recently, there's something called 17776 by John Boyes. He wrote a sequel 20,020, like which is set in the distant future, and it's great. It's a great piece of web fiction. I highly recommend it. But it was novel. Like it turned a lot of heads because like no one's really doing that kind of thing anymore. It's very interesting and it's a bit out there. So I don't think it's ever going to go completely away. What will actually happen, I actually don't know. It's very difficult to predict. I feel like a lot of creativity is just being focused down on video and podcasts because, like you say, putting up your own video hosting site or a complex multimedia piece that's got video incorporated into it is quite a lot more difficult than uploading a video to YouTube and letting YouTube host it. And so the barrier to entry is a little intimidating, or it can be if you want to do anything more complex than text.
Well, I did want to ask, is there any books you're working on currently? Do you have any current project you're working on?
I am working on a second book. It is not a sequel to Antimemetics. It's a new standalone book. Beyond that, I cannot talk about it right now, but I think it's going to be pretty good.
Awesome. Good to hear.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good time to wrap things up. As
Cool.
a final note, do you have anything that you would like to plug? And is there a sci-fi short story that you would like to recommend?
A particular sci-fi short story that I would like to recommend. There is, and I can't remember what it is. It was definitely out there. I had it in the tip of my tongue. I can't remember what it was. I might have to get back to you on that one. In terms of stuff to plug, Antimemetics is the book at the moment right now. That's the one. And until I've got a second book out, that's the one to buy. That and Valuable Humans in Transit, the collection. I think it's great. I think it starts strong, finishes strong. It's all strong content there. So I think you'll enjoy that kind of thing. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks to you all for listening, and we will see you all next week.
Welcome back. So, what were your thoughts on the episode?
So I really enjoyed this episode. It's not often that you get to interview someone that you've been reading for such a long time. I know we mentioned being longtime fans of Quantum in the episode and also elsewhere, but I think it's worth mentioning again that we've just really enjoyed Quantum for a long time. And I mean, me in particular, I've been reading him since middle school, but Gordon has been reading him for quite a long time as well. Which is kind of funny because I think for most readers of Antimemetics, he's like a new face on the scene. This is like his first traditionally published book, but he's also been putting out web fiction classics for quite a long time. And we're actually hoping to talk about some of them in afters. But yeah, how about you, Gordon? What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. Not quite so long ago as you, but I was introduced to him through Antimemetics, which I read at the end of high school, which is like 8 years ago now, so still a bit ago. Yeah, it was really cool to get to talk to him about it. Very cool to read Antimemetics in published form, which I did just before the interview because I hadn't read it as a published book yet. And while quite similar to the original version on the internet, there were a few differences, which was kind of cool to see. And I think the story flowed pretty well. As you mentioned, he also has a lot of stories we both enjoy. A lot of them are collected in this short story collection titled Valuable Humans in Transit. And yeah, I think we're probably going to talk about a few of those. So, what were your favorite stories from this?
So, my favorite stories in this collection are probably The Difference and maybe Lena as well. And then Cripes. Does anyone remember Google People? I think what these stories share is that they're kind of in an unusual format, sort of like Antimemetics itself, but maybe even more so. A lot of these are sort of in these IRC-esque chat logs, where not only are they internet chat logs, but they also have like the sorts of typos and cultural references and weird internet isms that you might see on the actual internet. And so I remember finding them quite refreshing because I feel like especially 10 or so years ago, it was kind of hard to find stuff like that in writing. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I guess that's part of what we're trying to figure out with this publication, but it was just hard to find literature that actually feels like it knows what the internet is. And that was something that I always found really compelling about quantum fiction. And to be honest, I like antimemetics a lot, but when I think of quantum, I don't really think of the antimemetics guy. I think of the guy who posted these cool internet fiction pieces on his website. And I'm like, oh yes, he wrote antimemetics. So I am definitely glad that antimemetics came out, but I'm also optimistic that maybe because this found such a wide audience, he'll be able to put out a more internet-y thing in the future to an even wider audience. So I think that would be my dream. The difference in particular is probably the most internety of these stories. I mean, Cripes is pretty internety as well, but this one is basically just this chat log from like the perspective of it's a narrator of unknown origin who is very confused and disoriented and trapped in a strange place that kind of resembles a video game. And he's just kind of caught in this revolving door of interactions where people are like joining the chat room and talking to him and like maybe laughing at him or maybe like not exactly sure what his deal is. And he just continues to become like more disoriented and confused about the facts of the situation. And the conclusion of the story ends up being like pretty disturbing. But like it's an interesting combination of like this very existentially terrifying story with this sort of like lighthearted internet lingo. And I would say this story has been pretty influential on me and the sorts of things that I want to write. I think Gordon, you're a pretty big fan of the story as well, right?
Yeah, this is probably my favorite story of his, and I'm just really impressed by it. In that, I think it's something that you could imagine being published today and being sort of cool, and you can kind of imagine it happening in the world. But this story was written. Actually, I don't know when this story was written, but probably like
I can check.
2010, something like that. And
It was written in 2007.
2007, yeah, even earlier. And it's like, well, I guess I'll kind of give spoilers on it, but Because the way the story is set up is that there are people talking to this entity on these internet chat logs who, they believe to be an AI, but, from the AI, from the, I guess, narrator's perspective, they are a, like, person that has been kidnapped and is, like, trapped in a prison cell, and they want to go home, and they're, like, telling people their address and stuff. I feel like you can sort of imagine nowadays, like, potentially just like jailbreaking some LLM and, getting them into some context window where they're pretending to be a person like kidnapped that wants to go home, and give them a fake backstory and stuff. And, this doesn't feel that impossible to do, to be honest. Like, someone could probably do this. And it's
I mean,
pretty creepy.
Have you read Moltbook at all?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that it's like a bit different, but AIs can easily, yeah, pretend to be people pretty believably, I feel like. And I don't know. At this point, LMs have passed the Turing test, right? And this was just like not the case at all in 2007. And I think it described like a pretty different type of artificial intelligence than was really seen in science fiction very much. I think there's definitely stuff where it's like, I don't know, some sort of AI, robot, whatever, pretending to be a human. But I feel like in that situation, it's always kind of taking this kind of passive, like, normal member of society type role, right? Like, trying to blend in and conform. It's pretty cool in this story to see like an AI pretending to be a human and being like, get me out, get me out, get me out, get me out, get me out. Which, would be the human reaction to being kidnapped. And yeah, definitely quite disturbing story, but also, yeah, very good.
Thing I talked about in the article is that I think it is a little bit unfortunate that, like, Antimemetics, when it came out, it got a really positive press cycle, and pretty much all of the press focused on how unprecedented the book was and how, like, novel and forward thinking all the concepts were. And I would say this applies even more so to Valuable Humans in Transit in these stories. But I think it is kind of disappointing in some way that it's like, yeah, that's true, but these stories, some of these are like 20 years old. Like, it's like, this is still like, like qualifies as this. So I think in some ways, like, the continued relevance of this kind of web fiction is sort of an indictment of how a lot of things in sci-fi haven't really changed as much as we might have expected them to. Or I guess a more positive way of looking at it is it can sort of it suggests the continued relevance of even older web fiction, in that, like, people can still get something out of it even though it's been 20 years later.
Yeah. Although to some extent it is like there are some things in these stories, I mean, particularly in The Difference, that are like literally as written predictive, but like now they are no longer predictive. They're just like true, which is just a flex. And on some level, something you want to achieve when writing sci-fi, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Quantum in the interview kind of disavowed his predictive ability, but some of these are just like, I don't know, seem pretty predictive to me.
Yeah, other one you mentioned, Cripes, Does Anyone Remember Google People? Is, yeah, I feel like that story is kind of interesting for me because my first foray into social media of any sort was in 6th grade, creating a Google Plus account. I don't know, did you ever use Google Plus?
I think I used it maybe a couple times. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Google People in this story is like sort of based off Google Plus.
Yeah, definitely.
And yeah, weird kind of social network thing where I don't remember why I even did this. I think it was like social media was kind of cool. This was like about a year before Instagram dropped. Like, Instagram dropped, I think, when we were in 7th grade, and everyone started doing that. And I don't know, wanted to be cool or something, but Facebook was like old and lame, so we gotta get on like the new trend, and the new trend was somehow fucking Google Plus. But was really pretty unremarkable social media site. Like, did not have a ton going for it. Like, really had no advantages in comparison to Facebook.
It was integrated with Google. It was
It was
integrated
integrated
with
with Google.
Google.
That was the biggest advantage. Yeah. And actually, yeah, to this day, like I don't have a default. Like I kind of, they didn't let you make the Google. Like I didn't want a profile picture because, like, I don't know, I was like 11 and was paranoid about privacy stuff, which I like still am to some extent, I guess. And so I just took a photo of like my hand incredibly zoomed in into the phone camera, which was just like a red thing, and then just like uploaded that as my Google profile pic. And to this day, that's like still my profile picture on Google because I've just never bothered to change it. And it's like basically the default one, except it's just like a red block, I guess. But this story, the social network portrayed is much stranger. And I think it's like a bit combined with like Google Glasses as well. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember Google Glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't. Did you ever actually like see anyone or like meet anyone who used those? Yeah.
No.
I like know them primarily from like the Niga Higa video making fun of them. But I think that there is something about like remembering these kind of like weird cultural fad things that never took off that you can like some like you can kind of like put strange events occurring into them and like somehow it all makes sense for a bit longer than it should. And I think that's kind of what happens in this story. Like it's clearly ridiculous at some point, but like for a while it's like, well, that could have happened.
Yeah. Yeah, so this story, Cripes, anyone remember Google People? It was originally posted on Twitter, actually, which is already very interesting. It's basically like these Twitter accounts talking about their memories on this defunct site called Google People. And then someone goes back to check on Google People, and it turns out there's still like all of this activity. And they're like, well, what's going on? And then they log in, and it just like totally freaks out because there's like new user activity. And as it turns out, there are like these sort of like doppelgangers, like cyber doppelgangers of everyone that are just sort of trying to train on their behavior and like do actions and like engage on Google People or engage with Google People in the way that like a normal human would. And it turns into this sort of like horror creepypasta thing. We're like, okay, wow, like what's really going on under here? Like for what purpose? And I actually think this story is by far the most ambitious and predictive of all the stories. Because like, I mean, that concept, like an AI like account being trained on like your data or whatever, and like posting stuff as a result. I don't know. That seems a lot more like both unthinkable at the time and also, very, very realistic nowadays. Like I would be surprised people are not already doing something to this effect. I think it actually kind of taps into the sort of unholy feeling that you get sometimes when you're going a little bit too hard with the AI and you're just like I don't know if what's going on right now sits right with me. Like I don't know if this is something we should be doing with our tools. So I think that story's aged really well, and I think there's still a lot to be gotten out of it even today.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, so like I was saying before, one of the interesting things about these stories is that they've appeared in multiple versions, and I do have this pet peeve where sometimes an author of web fiction will be writing something, and then most web fictions and especially web comics, the start are not as good as they end up being later in the story. And so it's pretty common for an author to just retcon the entire beginning of a fic and then just take the draft that they are now ashamed of off the internet forever. And I mean, it kind of annoys me because like sometimes there's stuff that you really want to see from the original, but it's just no longer there. And one thing that I quite admire about Quantum is that he leaves all the versions of the stories that he's written. There might be like version 1, version 2, version 3, published in different years. And he's very good about saying, like, all right, well, this is this version, but there's also this older version that also exists in this other place. And you might have read that. But I prefer you to read the newest version because that's the best one. But it's still worth keeping the old one around. And I think that's a very nice, like, it's sort of the philosophy that the philosophy that you would expect like a veteran programmer to have,
Yeah,
with
yeah.
flashbacks regarding backwards compatibility and stuff like that. It's like you don't want to be the person that breaks something by not making the new version of your programming language backwards compatible. Cough, cough, Python. But it kind of got me thinking of this thing that I didn't mention in the episode, but I think it would be really interesting if when you have a more expansive fictional universe, kind of like SCP Foundation, if you actually versioned it. And like software, you had the version dependencies of a given story inside of like the front of your story. So you're like, okay, this story requires version 2 of the difference for the canon to like make sense. And if you like use the latest version of the difference, it's not necessarily guaranteed to be coherent. But I think this is like very interesting because it suggests the idea of version bumping like a canon, or maybe just having like other versions of the canon that aren't even totally on this like numerical scale of like another like fictional universe that requires like this like set of dependency stories. I don't know if something like AO3 or anything like that would be techy enough to do this, but I think the possibilities are very interesting. The idea that you can sort of import like versions of stories and then allow like canons to evolve concurrently. I was like thinking about asking about that, but I couldn't really get off a good question in time.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, does Star Wars or Marvel really? I guess Marvel. What Marvel does is they just like make everything multiversal. So that
Yeah,
like
they
in
just
one universe this is happening, this is happening in another universe, which
but
sort
it's
of gets a
but it's
similar
very
effect.
messy.
But
Like it's very messy. Like because
yeah,
the point of this is like people already kind of do this, right? But they don't explicitly declare the dependencies, and so it's very weird. Like you can't
yeah,
really make sense of it unless you dig super deep. I think the other approach is like the Disney thing, like with Star Wars, right? Everything was canon that was official until Disney was like, all right, we're nuking everything, and this will be like old Star Wars stuff that's no longer canon. But
hmm,
I feel like that's kind of the worst of both worlds because then it prevents you from ever like importing some of that stuff as like a
yeah, yeah.
dependency ever again, right? Whereas like Disney could have been like, okay, we are like deprecating all this. Maybe it like imports them in the future. Like I feel like that could be sort of cool, but
Yeah.
obviously Disney doesn't want to deal with any of that kind of licensing stuff, so I can understand why they did it.
So how's the article you've been working on going?
Article's been going all right. I am currently writing an article about the Wandering Inn. Interestingly, the Wandering Inn was the very first thing I wrote an article about on Synthesized Sunsets, but it's been a while since I've talked about the Wandering Inn in specific. And I do like the original article I wrote about the Wandering Inn because I feel like it captures something very specific and unique, but it doesn't really capture the main thing that is specific and unique about the Wandering Inn, which is that it is really long. And there are a lot of people that ask, like, when I say that I read about web fiction, there's a lot of people that ask, like, okay, but what is web fiction? Like, is it really a separate thing? I know Quantum mentioned it being sort of a like a medium rather than a genre, but my opinion is that one of the main features of web fiction is that it is often very long, and this kind of sounds like, I guess, superficial on its face, but actually, when you have something that's very long, like very, very long, it has these interesting emergent properties that I feel like are not discussed enough. Because, I mean, even in the episode, Quantum mentioned that web fiction is sort of like novels that were serialized in the past, right? They have some of that structure. And that's sort of true. Like, they do have these serialized structures that you can recognize in, like, Charles Dickens. But that's not really what I think makes web fiction unique. I think what makes web fiction unique is it's really long, like 20,000 plus pages. And I think when you get to that point, you really do get to something that's qualitatively different from anything else. Even even serialized stories from a long time ago that have been running for a long time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how Wandering Inn does have these emergent properties, and a lot of times they are really good, but also a lot of times they are kind of bad. But the reason that these properties are kind of bad is it's sort of hard to have the good without the bad. Like there are certain qualities that are inherent to the medium that I think are really cool at their best, but also it's hard to work around their weaknesses. So anyway, I just think it was something worth shedding light on, given that we've written about web fiction for so long.
Yeah, whenever I talk, I don't necessarily want to say recommend, because I don't think The Wandering Inn's the best thing to recommend necessarily. But whenever I do talk about it to someone, I generally refer to it as having a genre of being long, which I
The
think
genre
I
of
think
long.
long, yeah, like more so than fantasy. I think this is the genre of the book, which yeah, and you just like can do a lot of different things as a result of just like being ridiculously long. You can have characters kind of go on character arcs, go through life in a way that, I don't know, you can see something happen to them over time that's just like too much shit for a normal book. You can also have like more different interactions with like groups of people where you like actually understand everyone, because I remember like one time when I was like sort of midway through like powering through it in I don't know, freshman year of college. I don't know, I was just like creating a list of my 20 favorite characters from The Wandering Inn, right? And I remember while doing this, it was, it was like really hard. Like there's a lot of characters like I hated. So it's not even like I like liked everyone, right? Necessarily. And then like, but like even among people I like really liked, it's like some had to be cut, even though it's 20 characters. But it's like when you're in the middle of reading this, you can kind of just like off the top of your head, like sort of just like think of like, I don't know, 70 people who get a decent amount of time, like, potentially as much, each of them as much as the protagonist in like a normal 300-page novel, which is, yeah, pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, so I guess the most obvious thing that this allows you to do, like Gordon was saying, is that you can kind of just dive into characters' inner worlds to a much greater extent than you could in a normal novel. And the example that I typically use is this part of the story called Wistrom Days. So Wistrom is this magical school that's kind of like Hogwarts that is relevant to the story initially because these two characters named Saria and Pisces both went there, and they sort of vaguely allude to this falling off that they had there. But Wistrom is only sketched out in these very vague terms for most of the beginning part of the novel. And there's this one part where they're just sitting in a carriage, Saria and Pisces and the main character Aaron, and then Aaron just like asks them like, "Yo, so like, what happened at Wistrom anyway?" And then Saria just like starts recounting it and just drops like an entire novel. It's an entire novel worth of like what happened. And then that just happens. And you
Yeah.
just like basically get an entire novel that's like Hogwarts but different, like in miniature. And you're like, wow, that was crazy. That really just happened. And then Aaron's just kind of like cool, and then the story just like continues. I mean, they're not like cool, but like them telling the story doesn't really have any ramification for the plot. It establishes canon, but like they did just kind of tell this story, like in the story, like it's kind of just no big thing, and you wouldn't be able to do that in a normal novel. Like that would be insane. But I mean, yeah, this is just one of the things that most endeared me to The Wandering Inn, and I still think about this particular section of the book quite a lot. So that is one thing that you're able to do, and I think that because The Wandering Inn has these sort of cutaways so often, they're able to make you feel like the world is very alive, and not only that these other places exist, but that you will actually go there. When a place is mentioned enough times, you kind of assume that like, well, at a certain point, author's just
Yeah.
gonna drop a novel where you're there. That's a pretty crazy expectation to have. But I think because that expectation is there, even if it doesn't happen, it still kind of adds to the reading experience because of the way the story is told, you just imagine this as a distinct possibility, which you can only do if you imagine this place in a very vivid, real way. So I think this is a really important aspect of reading The Wandering, and it's kind of hard to communicate to someone who's never read it.
Yeah, I mean, this really happens with characters as well. Like, there's tons of different perspectives that go on, and like, most characters at some point will have a chapter from their perspective. Like sometimes there'll be a character that's like sort of major but has never gotten a chapter, and there's like really a cool anticipation that happens. Like the biggest example I can think of for this is there's this character called Bird, who's just like a pretty goofy dude. But he kind of like went a long time where he was kind of like a sort of cool comic relief character who was pretty major, but didn't have anything from his perspective, right? And then there's this one chapter. It's like the first one in the start of the 6th volume of the story. And it's like Bird is the protagonist for this series of chapters, and it's just like he like goes to a different city on his own, and it's just like an incredible arc, like one of the best in the story, and it's something that I've been like look forward to for a long time, and like
Is this like
Bird
yeah,
going
is
to
this like
Palace.
where volume 7, yeah, where he goes to Palace. Yeah.
Oh, that's volume 7, not volume 6. Yeah, you're right. Start of volume 7. Remember when we had like Naomi Kanakia on, and she was saying like one of the main justifications for like her telling short stories in kind of this tale format is that it requires like a lot of buy-in to get
Mhm.
someone to read something. Yeah, like a short story just out of the blue, right?
Yeah.
I think like The Wandering Inn just like has such a ridiculous amount of buy-in, and I think like you can use this to your advantage. Like the reader is already so bought in at a certain point that you can just kind of like get to tell stories in like a different way. Like you don't
Oh.
need to like hook some, like you don't need a hook for a story because like they're already reading it, or like I don't know, you can just orient things differently. It just you don't need everything to be like justified in the same way you do when you're like writing a short story or a normal novel. And I think this kind of allows you to do things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that didn't actually make it into the article, but which I thought about is like, not only is there this expectation that like something will, like a character or a place will just like get a pretty prominent mention in the Wandering Inn. I feel like because so much stuff from the real world gets pulled in, you also start to get that feeling about stuff in the real world. Like, I remember for a while I was just thinking that like, you know what hasn't showed up in the Wandering Inn yet? Bubble tea. And I was like, I feel like that's gonna show up at some point. I feel like that's crazy to expect that. It's just like
Yeah.
a second world, like a Portal fantasy second world, where like bubble tea has never been mentioned. There's never been any
It
indication
doesn't
that
exist in the world as at
yeah,
current.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's no indication that Pyrodava has any opinion about bubble tea. Like there's really no reason to expect this other than like everything eventually exists in the Wandering Inn.
And it
But I'm
comes to
pretty sure it got
eventually, right?
introduced
Yeah.
in like 8 or something, and I was like,
Yeah.
I wasn't surprised. I was kind of like, I wasn't like, oh, it actually showed up. I was sort of just like, yeah, of course. Like it was bound to show up eventually. I think it kind of reminds me of how like, there's that thing about like if a universe is big enough, you'll start running into like copies of you or something, just because of like the probabilities of matter arranging itself in like certain ways. Like there will eventually be Earths that are just like very, very, very similar to like this existing Earth. Like if stuff gets big enough, I feel like that's kind of an analog for like Wandering Inn a bit. Like it's just sort of like so big that like you can expect to find anything, and this sort of changes the reading experience in weird ways that are hard to articulate. Another thing that's interesting about the Wandering Inn is that it allows you to tell bigger stories, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of sci-fi that tells really big stories, like Foundation, like it'll tell the story of like human civilization basically. But I think that those big stories, those big space operas, I think they naturally have to take a perspective that's a little bit inhuman. They kind of have to be from like the POV of like the universe sort of, and just like this wide angle view that just doesn't really resemble how an actual human would like experience these changes or the world. And I think this is actually a reason why a lot of people who like literary fiction don't like these kinds of stories, is because they really like fiction that situates them like in the world and changes how they see things like in their life and connects to things in their life. And if they're reading something that's that wide scope, it just sort of feels, okay, what is this? But I think The Wandering Inn is interesting in that, like, because it is so long, it can sort of do both. it can tell the story of civilization changing over time in these major ways, but it can also do this by situating yourself in like mundane situations and just observing these changes as like a normal person would. It's like when like World War One started, something, right? Like it wasn't just like 1914, and then everyone's just like, World War One is starting, which is maybe more akin to how it would be described in a big sort of like sweeping fantasy novel with centuries or millennia of scope, right? It's like, oh, World War One started. It's like, nah, like that's not really how it worked. You would have some people in the middle who are like, something is starting, but the vast majority of people would just be like, well, something's going on in the Balkans somewhere. That's pretty interesting. Like, yeah, and then just like go about their day. And it's only like after the fact the implications become obvious. And I think there are a few times in the Wandering Inn where you actually see that happen. Like there's something that's just kind of like sprinkled in, like, oh, this thing is changing, and like, oh, this is also changing. And then like there's some big thing that happens, and you're like, oh shit, like I should have seen this. But the implications were, I mean, not obvious at the start, but then like obvious in hindsight. And I think it's kind of cool that they're able to achieve this effect, like not just for the characters, but also for you, the reader. Like there were a few times where a technology was developed in a certain way, and then there's like this big reveal of like the ultimate like geopolitical impact, and you're like, well, like I really didn't see that coming. And I think it's kind of cool that a story can be big enough to induce this effect, because if the story wasn't this big, like I don't know how you'd be able to tell such a story.
All right, well, I think that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all in a couple weeks.